Hi class, this is Sir Alex Basco and welcome to our lesson in General Biology 2. Today we are going to veer it off to a totally different topic. We are going to focus now on the origin of life. We're basically going to talk about evolution and the theories behind evolution, as well as the history of the Earth. So this would be some parts in our lesson. But today we're just going to focus a little bit about, more specifically about the history of the Earth. So at the end of today's lesson, 4.1, what I want everyone be able to do is for you guys to be able to describe the general features of the Earth's history, including generally accepted dates, or dates that should be dates, sorry, accepted dates and sequence of geological timescale, characteristics of major groups of organisms present during this time period. So this is the goal of today's lesson. But before we can actually go into understanding the history of the Earth, let's take a little bit of a discussion on life. So let's ponder this. How did everything on Earth begin? So this is some of the paradox that a lot of the researchers have been asking. How did the Earth begin? We know a lot of the theories behind the creation of the Earth. If you're religious, you would believe that God created the Earth. But a lot of atheists, or those who do not believe in the existence of God and believe in the theory behind the science, that the universe began with a Big Bang theory, and the Earth began basically by the compression of some gaseous materials floating into air until it creates a star and it creates a planet. So some of the things just want you guys to think about while we discuss. Also, among all the planets in the universe, or after the Earth is created, why did why did the planet Earth, why did life spark or starts to exist on Earth? What was the cost? So some of the things that we have discussed previously is, the soup theory, wherein various oxygen or various atmospheres in the Earth results in the creation of life, abiogenesis, things like that. So this we only have theories. Theories, they're great because they have research backing them up, but we cannot state for sure that they are facts. Facts are different from theories. Facts means that they are true and they are uncontestable truths. But for theory, they're working theories. We're still continuing to improve our knowledge on them. So now let's talk about evolution. Today we discuss or think about evolution in two ways. One is we think about evolution as basically the progenitors, or the offsprings or descendants of basically people that have lived in the past. And in evolution, we think of it in a way of ancestors, of our ancestors. We know that descendants, us today, we're basically related to some distant ancestors in the past. So that's one way to think about evolution. And majority would think of it this way. But we can also think of evolution as a dynamic and multifaceted process. What we'd say about dynamic and multifaceted is continuous. Not only is evolution about our ancestors, but evolution is also about the relationship of the development or changes that have happened to human, to the animals surrounding them, and to the world around them, and how these changes affect various situations. So the factors that have led to evolution of species. So basically creation of new species, creations of new landmark. So we can think of evolution that way. In the end, what evolutionary biologists, or those biologists that study the evolutionary of the world and humans, what they aim to understand is first, what caused evolution? What was the reason behind evolution? You can think of this way as microevolution, the process that the organisms change in small ways. What was the reason behind these changes, these small changes in small ways? And eventually, as these small changes keep happening, there comes a macroevolution wherein It explains the history of life forms on Earth and how species are related to other species. So if we have a species, two different species, and how these species are related to each other, there happen to be a macroevolution. When we talk about macroevolution, this is a larger evolutionary change, wherein from one species there existed a new species. So one species keeps changing in small ways until there's such a time that these small changes created a new species. So that's macroevolution. So these are the three things that evolutionary biologists are trying to understand. What was the reason behind the evolution and the relationship between various species. So that's how we can think of evolution. But we cannot think about evolution without understanding living things. Now let's ask ourselves, what is life? If you guys remember our discussion about cells, we've actually kind of answered what is life. But in reality, life is not a very simple concept to understand. It is very vague. One of the issues is that it's very vague. What is life? It's a very vague. When we say vague, in another word, it's malabo. It's a very unclear. What do we mean by life? So it is very difficult to put a definition on life. So what we do is we actually, the easiest way to define life is to put characteristics on it. When we discuss about self, we also discussed what is life. And if you guys remember the three tenets of the cells, first is that living things come from another cell and that the living things multiply. If you guys remember those tenets. And again, that's not basically a definition of life, but that's just a characteristics of a cell that gives us a little bit of idea what life is. So the easiest way to define life is actually write list of characteristics that are shared by all life forms. So these are some of the few. There's actually quite some of them, but we're just focusing on these few. We know that life has cellular complexity. We discussed about this. So if an organism starts or comes from cell, and if they're duplicating and multiplying, then we know that something is alive. So there is life there. So that's one of the characteristics of life is that there's cellular complexity happening. So there's a there's a cell and then the cell divided. So you can see there, let's keep dividing. So that's what we think about life. That's one of the characteristics of life. Every living thing starts from a single cell that keep multiplicating and multiplicating until it creates the organism. That's how we were created. We starts from two half cells or haploids, the egg cells and the sperm cells that combine, creating a zygote. And from that singular zygote, single cell zygote, it starts to multiply until we now, as a person, have about trillion of cells. We are made up of about trillions of cells. Another thing that is important, as these cells keep developing, we now have growth and development. Every living thing has a growth and development. There is a change of phase, there's growth. So from small single organisms, or not organism, from one single cell, we are now multitudes of cells. And this, as these cells keep developing, these cells becomes our heart, becomes our skins, becomes our bone. So there's a growth and development. And there's also, as we keep growing, the cell starts to die until we faces death. So that's one of the characteristics of life. There's cellular complexity, and there's growth and development. Another thing is reproduction. Life tends to reproduce. There is a tendency to duplicate as a cell, but to procreate as human beings. We want to produce offsprings. That's one of the characteristics of life. If not we want, we can. There's a tendency and there's an ability to reproduce. So for example here, so we have a baby here. So we have a bird hatching from its egg. If you guys haven't seen one, it kind of looks like that. They don't have feather in the beginning. And so if you have taken care of a CCO, when they were hatched from the egg, they're actually naked. They don't have feathers, but as they grow, the feathers starts coming out. So there's a tendency to reproduce, or we can reproduce. We can procreate and create another human being, or for animals, they can create their own species. So there's a reproduction in life. Another thing, irritability. Do not get confused it when you get annoyed by a person. Irritability also talks about sensitivity to a stimulus. Stimulus is something, um, a trigger. You can think of stimulus as a trigger, something that affects you, and then if you respond to that stimulus, there's sensitivity. So we can also think about that as irritability. So, for example, I'm not sure how you call this in Cavite, but here we call it makahiya. Probably it's just the same word. I'm not sure if that's, I think that's the Tagalog word, makahiya. So there's so the stimulus is the touch, and then there's irritability or response. It is sensitive to outside environment. So you can think of it this way. This way, you can also think about how humans tend to respond to their outside environment. Kapag sobrang init, you want to go inside an air-conditioned room. If it is raining, you don't want to get wet. So life itself responds to the outside environment. And lastly, among other things, there's homeostasis. Homeostasis, if you think about homeostasis, you would think balance. And that's kind of like a misnomer. There is balance in there. But when we talk about homeostasis, it's basically the life's ability to keep itself under a normal condition. There is a normal condition that the life wants to be in. If for example, if you draw a scale here, and both ends of that scale is extreme, life tends to go just in between the normal. If it tends to go outside any of the normality or extreme, there's a tendency that life would be in danger. So what it does is it wants to go back. There's a loop, there's a feedback. So if you tend to go towards one of the extreme, everything organ in the body would want to put the body back to the normal. So there's homeostasis, and this is very different in the outside environment. Every living organism has its homeostasis within them, but our outside environment does not have an homeostasis. I mean, it has a pattern of weather, but it's very different in a way that living organisms tend to stay under a normal condition. That's what we call homeostasis. So these are some of the characteristics of life. So if an organism has all of these, among some other things, then that organism has life. So that's one of the few ways that we can define life. So now that we know a little bit about evolution and about life, let's begin to the very beginning. How and answer the question that we have earlier about pondering how did the earth began. So let's go back about CA here means circa, which basically means approximately. So circa or approximately 4.6 to 3.8 billion years ago is what happens is the formation of the Earth's crust and the ocean. So after you can say the creation of the universe, after the Big Bang theory, and there are some debris. When you think about debris, it's a pieces of a broken something. So you can, for example, if there's an earthquake and the building fell off, the pieces of the building, you can think of it as a debris. You can also think of debris as very small particles, but think of debris as very massive pieces of rocks. Of, for example, you have a you can think of a planet, and then the planet exploded, and that pieces of planet, you can think of that as the degree. So when the universe created, via Big Bang, we call it Big Bang because there's a kind of like a massive explosion. You can think of it that way. So because of Big Bang and the creation of the universe, when the Earth was formed, there are some debris falling from the celestial. Or when we talk about celestial, it's basically the outer space. From the outer space, so the debris keeps bombarding the surface of the Earth. So you have a very early Earth, and the surface of the Earth is very hot because of the bombarding debris. So the debris keeps falling into the Earth. And what happens is because the surface of the Earth is very hot, we don't have a crust yet. What we have is basically this liquid mantle. It's basically an ocean of magma in the Earth. And as years go by, as you can see, this is kind of like a very long years. As years starts to pass, the temperature starts to cool down. And once the temperature is cold enough, the ocean magma that is present in the surface of the Earth starts to solidify. And now what we have is basically the Earth's crust. And what happens is that we start to create an ocean. So because when things solidify, it's not basically flat, especially magma. It's not flat. There's some divots, so there's some areas like canyons and valleys. So there's an area here, and then there's a divot that can store water, and then there's another area like that. So we can now have like canals for oceans and for waters to go forth. But around this time, 4.6 to 3.8 billion years ago, that's what happens. We have an ocean of magma, and then as the temperature cools down, the magma solidify, creating the Earth's crust, and then the ocean starts to form. And the composition of the atmosphere is very debatable, but recently the accepted theory of the composition of atmosphere during the early Earth is that there's about 20% oxygen. It's about the same as we have now. We have about 21% oxygen today. There's 10% carbon dioxide, which is actually quite a lot. There's about 5 to 7% of hydrogen sulfide. There's some trace amounts of nitrogen. And you can see here, very weird because nowadays we have about 78% of nitrogen, but back then there's just trace amounts. When we say trace amounts, very small amounts. There's also carbon monoxide, some hydrogen, independent hydrogen atoms, and some methane or CH4, and some inert gases. Inert gases are the ones at the 8 column or the group 8 of your periodic table, like helium, argon, xenon. Those are inert gases. They're not very reactive. So this is the initial composition of the Earth. So this is about approximately 4.6 to 3.8 billion years ago. Then what happens is that approximately 3.5 billion years ago, we have the earliest form of life that we have as of date. Microbial reefs called stromatolites, it starts showing up at the shoreline all over the world. And stromatolites are basically sedimentary rocks, and they were created by basically laying together. So, for example, you put one piece and then let it cool down and solidifies, and then you put another piece. So you were creating something like this. So as you can see, there are some uh, layers, and these layers is created by creation a lot of processes. And if you actually take a stromatolite and cut it open, this is what you would see. And what we found is that when we open these stromatolites is inside of these layers, there are some trapped microbial microbes, or basically bacteria and some single-celled organisms. And that is the earliest dated life that we know that have existed on the Earth. So basically, life is started in the Earth of about 3.5 billion years ago. And the first inhabitants are basically bacteria or single-cell organisms that um, that are found in stromatolites. And then, in about 3 billion years ago, we finally have a blue-green algae. Blue-green algae. If you guys are not familiar with algae is, I'm not sure if you guys know this. Lumot. If you've seen lumot, yung parang mga green. If you see stagnant water means not moving water. So, and then kapag may mga green stuff sa taas ng tubig, yung mga lumot, that's green algae. And that green algae is actually cyanobacteria. They started about 3.5 billion years ago. So there's proliferation. When we say proliferation, there's an increase in number of cyanobacteria. And they have tried 3 billion years ago, and cyanobacteria are actually are photosynthetic. You know that they're photosynthetic because they're green, they have chlorophyll, so they um, cyanobacteria, or basically the blue-green algae, are the first bacteria to be able to use the light energy and convert that light energy into chemical energy via photosynthesis. So they're photosynthetic organisms. And what happens if we have photosynthesis? If you guys remember what happens in I'm not sure. I don't think we've discussed photosynthesis, but you're familiar about it. Plants use photosynthesis to create food, but moreover, they use the carbon dioxide present in the atmosphere, and then they release what? They release oxygen. So what happens is about 3.5 billion years ago, there's a shift or there's a change of the atmosphere in the Earth. What happened is because there's so much algae, there's so much lumot or cyanobacteria, there's a massive increase in the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. So that's what happens. And oxygen is actually necessary for life. We know that because we use oxygen to breathe. And because of this change in oxygen, it paved the beginning of biodiversity in the planet. So the increased amounts of oxygen, this change in the shift of the atmosphere in the Earth, provided a way for more uh, diverse life to begin. So, in about 2 billion years ago, due to the changes in the atmosphere, eukaryotes finally arrived. So, about 1 billion years after the immense creation of oxygen, there are more plants, there are more flora that starts to develop until there's such a time that we have the first eukaryotes. So before 2 billion years ago, what we all have are only prokaryotes or single-celled organisms. But about 2 billion years ago, this multicellular organism finally starts to appear. The eukaryotes starts to appear. If you guys remember, eukaryotes are cell with membrane-bound organelles. And what scientists believe that led to the creation of eukaryotes is that the process of endosymbiosis. If you remember endosymbiosis, we discussed it a little bit. Endosymbiosis is basically there's an organism living inside the another organism. So nowadays, we've talked about this about your mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. There's actually a mitochondrial DNA. So that's one of the evidence that scientists believe that the mitochondria inside our body used to be a prokaryote, used to be a single-celled organism with its own DNA, and the eukaryotes basically engulfed that organism, and that organism that was engulfed or was swallowed became part of its system. Now what we have is our organelle. So it became an organelle. It became an organ inside the cell. So it assimilates, it becomes part of it. So that's what we call endosymbiosis. So that's what scientists believe to be the start of eukaryotes about 2 billion years ago. And then about 1.2 billion years ago, during this time, there's a massive increase of multicellularity. So multicellularity, so meaning we are now duplicating these cells more and more. So there's a massive increase, and this happens over several times due to the symbiotic relationship. And this is a result because of the symbiotic relationship, the one that I'm talking about, the endosymbiosis. It led to interdependency between these organisms. So some of the organisms get swallowed, they become dependent on the organ or the organism that swallowed them. They become part of that organism. So there's an exchange of interdependency between them. So in order for that swallowed organisms to live, it needs to stay inside of the other organisms. So there's a massive increase of multicellularity during 1.2 billion years ago. And then about 500 million years ago, what we call the Cambrian explosion. Cambrian explosion is what happens suddenly when there's a drastic increase of diverse faunal species. Fauna basically means animal species. So from just small cells or the various cells, we have now various animals existing on the Earth. During the Cambrian explosion, there's a massive increase in various species of animals. And then major animal phyla, or this is just a type of a taxonomic group of major animals, it starts to appear during this period. So we have some examples, the trilobites. If you're familiar with the trilobites, the picture that you have on your module is a picture of a fossil of a trilobite. So that's what happens during 500 million years ago. And this is also the time that about we have the Jurassic period, blah blah blah, all those various animals. There's a massive, um, basically a massive party of various animals and species. And then about 200,000 years ago, this is where the arrival of modern human happened. So evidence, paleontological evidence, it starts to believe that us humans evolved from another an animal, the Homo erectus. So we evolved from these animals. So that's where the theory comes from, that we evolved from monkeys, right? So Homo erectus is a type of the species that we evolved from as humans. So that happened about 200,000 years ago. That modern, like what we have now, is what we have. So that is basically the Earth's history. What I want you guys to remember are basically the dates and what happens during those dates, because that's the goal of today's lesson. If you guys have any question about these, do not hesitate to message me. And thank you so much. May you guys have a great day.